is for people experiencing homelessness. Sorry, I heard a little a little message to me. So before we begin, I would just like to take a couple of minutes to introduce you to CPRA. The Canadian Parks and Recreation Association is a national organization dedicated to realizing the full potential of parks and recreation as a major contributor to community health and vibrancy. Over its 60-year history, CPRA has been the national voice for parks and recreation, advancing the collective interests of our members. CPRA is a national network dedicated to the well-being of people, communities, and the natural and built environments. And CPRA provides services for our members and partners that cultivate dialogue, learning, and innovation. CPRA's strength comes from the experience, expertise, and network of the staff and board members from our membership, which is the 13 provincial and territorial associations. We also work with volunteers, government partners, and a number of allied sectors such as physical activity, sport, education, public health, and others that help to help us progress our goals, and then we strive to help them meet ours. We have a virtual office with 6 staff, and as the national office of CPRA is located in Ottawa, I would like to acknowledge that CPRA is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Mohawk First Nations. We acknowledge the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and of the original peoples in what we now know as Canada, and we aim to contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey we all share together. For those of us who are settlers, through our work at CPRA, we commit to recognizing and honoring the relationships between Indigenous people, their way of life, and their land. Last summer, we introduced something new to CPRA called The Bench, and that is CPRA's new online community, which is a place for the sector to meet, work, and grow together. The Bench features COVID-19 resources and other resources, which hopefully we don't have to be talking about for too much longer. We have a number of events that you can post there and find out about. We have discussion groups, and there's a portal dedicated to the Framework for Recreation in Canada, a portal dedicated to Parks for All and professional development opportunities, as well as a new job hub. And then coming soon, we're going to be moving over the benefits hub. So if you're looking for benefits for a potential grant application that you might be writing or a briefing note, you'll be able to go on to the benefits hub and find all the information that you need. So we'd encourage you to sign up for the Bench, share the link with your colleagues to help it quickly grow into a really vibrant online community. So before we begin with our presentation today, which I'm really excited about, I'd just like to remind you that we are going to be taking questions and answers at the very end of our session today. So please, throughout the presentation, feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. It would be best if you can put them in the Q&A versus the chat, just because sometimes there's a lot of sharing of information in the chat, but I don't want to miss any questions that you might have. So if possible, just put them in throughout and I'll get to them towards the end. So I'd now like to introduce you to our first speaker today. Caitlin Schwan is the Director of Research at The Shift and Senior Researcher at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Dr. Schwan is an appointed assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Caitlin's research focuses on homelessness prevention and the human right to housing, particularly for women and youth. She is the former lead researcher for the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, with whom she co-wrote a national protocol for homeless encampments in Canada, a human rights approach. Caitlin also co-chairs the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, where her work focuses on leveraging lived experience, voices, and research to drive policy change on women's homelessness. So thrilled to have you, Caitlin. So I will turn everything over to you.
Thank you so much, Krista. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I've been thinking a lot, especially in the midst of COVID, about the incredibly important role that Parks and Recreation departments play with respect to housing and homelessness. This really is, at this point in time, particularly kind of a moment of life and death where we have public policy that focuses on the need to stay at home, and we have huge numbers of folks across Canada who don't have access to adequate housing. So Parks and Recreation has this very important moment, I think, in Canada right now to kind of step into leadership around supporting folks who are living unhoused. So such a pleasure to be here and to chat with all of you about this. I have kind of 3 takeaways that I wanted you folks to walk away with today. The first is that homelessness is not inevitable. I think there's a sense that this is kind of an intractable issue in Canada, that we've had it forever, that this is going to be kind of the cyclical process, but we're not really going to make progress on it. But what we know from research and from history certainly is that it's just isn't true. We haven't always had homelessness in Canada, and we can prevent and end it. The second very key piece and related piece is that homelessness is not the result of personal failures. It's really about policy choices we've made at the federal and provincial, territorial, and municipal level across Canada for many years. And in that way, there's tremendous hope insofar as there are policy solutions for this issue. And then the third thing I really want us to talk about a bit is that housing in Canada now is established as a human right in federal legislation. And this has huge implications for how we think about engaging folks who are experiencing homelessness, who are residing in encampments. So for folks who are in the parks and recreation field, this will have huge implications for you. And it's kind of a really exciting moment. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to walk us through. But I'm also going to try to set us up with just a very quick kind of homelessness 101. What are the causes? Where are we at in Canada statistically with the number of folks experiencing it? And then talk about housing as a human right. Great. So to get us all on the same page, really key to understand that when we're talking about homelessness, we're really talking about a continuum of housing precarity. So in 2012, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness came together, developed this definition on homelessness, where we outlined kind of 4 types of homelessness. The first 2 that you'll see there, unsheltered and emergency sheltered, are kind of what we typically think of when we think about homelessness. It's folks who are either living on the streets, in parks, kind of living rough, so to speak, or are emergency sheltered. So those folks who are residing in shelters of various kinds. But also there's huge numbers of folks who are provisionally accommodated. So whether that's couch surfing, whether that's being evicted and staying in a motel, as well as folks who are at risk of homelessness. So living in unsafe situations, in crowded situations, in situations of abuse. We really need, when we're thinking about addressing homelessness and how it intersects with this field, we need to be thinking about that broad spectrum. And I mean, part of this is a real piece around what does hidden homelessness look like in Canada? So MJ, if you could go forward 1 slide. Yeah, perfect. So today we're really talking largely about folks who are living in encampments where it's largely visible forms of homelessness, but there's huge populations that are experiencing hidden forms of homelessness. In part because they are avoiding shelters for important reasons, or because shelters or other services are unable to meet their needs. And I know our panelists are going to speak about this a little bit more, but I just wanted to highlight that when we're thinking about parks and recreation and its role with respect to homelessness, we need to be thinking about that spectrum. And I mean, certainly a simple place to start is thinking about language. So as you'll hear, I'm saying people experiencing homelessness rather than homeless people. And the focus there is to try to center the person rather than categorizing them or categorizing their experience. So that person-centered language is an easy place to start. And being clear that this is a circumstance that someone's living in, it doesn't define them, and kind of making sure our language reflects that. So what is the scale of the issue? This kind of gives you, quite frankly, we have, methodologically, it's really challenging to get at the scale of homelessness in Canada. It's difficult to measure. But we know that at least 250,000 of people in Canada are experiencing homelessness in a given year. That's 30,000 on any given night, and 5,000 folks who are actually living rough on the street. And we know this is an underestimation. The numbers are actually quite a bit higher. And certainly, as many of you will know, in the midst of COVID, we've seen increases in eviction and housing precarity and poverty. So what Canada is likely dealing with kind of over the coming years is an increase in homelessness. And certainly we've seen an increase in encampments, in part related to the growth in housing precarity across the country. I also wanted to touch on the causes of homelessness very briefly. It's helpful to think about homelessness as kind of being caused in three large domains. The first one is really what we refer to as structural causes. So that's kind of causes rooted in how we organize our economy, how we organize our social safety net, looking at historical patterns of oppression like anti-Black racism and colonialism, and the effects on poverty, on lack of affordable housing. That's kind of very foundational for understanding this issue, combined with a look at how our public systems work to actually create pathways into homelessness and housing precarity for folks. So some of that has to do with gaps in services, so lack of mental health care supports, lack of housing supports. Some of it has to do with problems within public systems as well. So I've been working in the area of youth homelessness for quite a while, and we know that young people transitioning out of the child welfare system, or out of foster care, have tremendous difficulties accessing housing. Quite a common story for folks who age out at age 18 is they're kind of given their clothes in a garbage bag and said kind of good luck, and then really struggle to access and maintain housing after that kind of transition. So it's these problems in public systems that also contribute to homelessness. And then certainly at the individual level, we know that experiences of trauma, experiences of violence, unexpected job loss, those individual causes can create the conditions for homelessness. So it's really these three pieces at play. But what I do want to emphasize is culturally, we often talk about the individual causes. But in many circumstances, for folks that say are suffering with a health issue that contributed to their homelessness, really what we're talking about is a healthcare policy failure where we weren't able to meet their needs, and the result was folks entering into homelessness in a way that for many others, the system might have worked. So when you're engaging with someone who's experiencing homelessness, you're really speaking with someone who is living out the failures of the ways in which we've organized our public systems. And yeah, briefly, I also wanted, on the structural side, many of you, I imagine would know this, but the causes, like a kind of a simple illustration of structural causes of homelessness is just to look at what our investment in social housing in Canada has looked like over the last 20 years. Kind of following World War II, there was a big spike in federal investment in social housing. In 1973, we started building like 10,000 social housing units across the country every year. And at that time, truly, there was almost no homelessness. There were folks who were very underhoused, folks who were living in rooming houses that were very poor conditions or were unstably housed, but we didn't have street homelessness or visible homelessness in the way we do now. Beginning in '84 and particularly in '93, we really saw federal divestment in investments in social housing. It was kind of left up to the private market. Provinces and territories kind of had to try to deal with it themselves, the issue around affordable and accessible housing. And that is really where we see an increase in homelessness across Canada, was during these periods of time. So you can really map this quite clearly, the relationship between federal investment in housing and homelessness. So it is a policy choice, and in that way it's not inevitable, but these were the policy choices we've been making for a very long time. Fortunately, in the last couple of years, we've had the federal government kind of come back to the table, so to speak, and begin to really seriously reinvest in housing and homelessness. So the impacts of that on the number of folks experiencing homelessness are beginning to emerge, but we'll really see kind of over the next decade or so. And the final point that Oh, yes. I forgot about this slide. This is great. The last thing I wanted to emphasize on kind of around causes of homelessness and thinking about why we're seeing the numbers of folks on the street right now that we are. I mean, as many of you will know in your community, shelters are at capacity and they have been for so long in so many cities and communities. Um, there was a really powerful study done by Statistics Canada that you see on the slide here, where they were actually looking at how many people were turned away from domestic violence shelters just on a single day in 2018. And almost 1,000 women and children who were experiencing abuse, we turned away, just largely due to capacity issues. So I mean, this is just the domestic violence sector. We know this is happening in the homelessness sector too. So when you meet folks who are residing in parks or residing on streets, chances are many of these folks have also tried to access services or shelters and been unable to access them truly because of capacity issues. And yeah, this is true in many, many communities across the country. And finally, kind of what I want to leave you with to think about, and I know our panelists will speak about this a little further, is we're in a very important and for me, very exciting moment in Canada where we have established housing as a human right in federal legislation. In 2019, in June, we adopted housing into the National Housing Strategy Act, this right to housing. And it's based on the idea that housing is not a privilege. It is foundational to human life, and it must be protected and ensured by governments. And the way it's written in our legislation is it's based on international human rights law around housing. And that law actually has very high standards and is quite specific in a range of ways. So I won't have time to get into it, but what I did want to point you folks to is I worked with the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing to build out a national protocol on homeless encampments in Canada. And it kind of specifies this is how governments should engage in a rights-based way with folks who are residing in encampments. And I think, something I'm really interested in and would be so excited to talk to any folks on this panel about is like, what does this look like for parks and recreation departments? Because it certainly this protocol provides kind of a range of standards about what it means to engage in a rights-based way. And there's 8 principles outlined throughout it, but and I think we'll chat about this later, but a really important piece is that folks who are residing in encampments are community members. We're talking about folks' homes and engaging them as rights holders, as neighbors, as people that are expressing their right to housing in the way that they're able to and through the materials they've access to. And so governments and parks and recreation departments need to be really thoughtful about the work they do, because it really is human rights work that you're doing. And it is an area that is protected under human rights law. And yeah, just one more slide. Thank you, MJ. Yeah, perfect. As part of this, it's so critical that we are engaging directly with folks who are living these experiences, that we're not only listening to their voices, but that they have power in decision making. So something we've been doing at The Shift is developing a series of videos from around the world of folks who are residing in homelessness or in encampments. And I'm going to drop a link to this video in the chat because we don't have time to look at it, but this is a video from Jason, who's in Victoria, who's residing in an encampment and kind of talks about the challenges that he's facing. So I just really deeply encourage you to have a quick look at that video. I think it's only 2 minutes. And I'll also put a link to the national protocol that we developed around homeless encampments. But yeah, I mean, lastly, I would just say, you folks have such an incredible, parks and recreation departments have such an incredible opportunity in Canada right now, as we're moving into a post-pandemic moment, as we're ramping up our understanding of what the right to housing really means in parks and across the country. There is this real opportunity to really think about what does it mean to ensure equitable inclusion of folks who are residing in parks, and to engage them as right holders. So thank you very much.
Caitlin, we have a little bit of time if you want to try to play the video. Should we try it?
Oh, sure.
Okay, let's give it a go. I think MJ can try it. We'll see if it'll see if it'll play.
You know what? It might be a screenshot. We might not be able to. Yeah.
Oh, well, that was a great idea. It's too bad. That's okay. No worries. Thank you for providing it. MJ did put the link in the chat for everybody.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And I'll put the link in the chat for this wonderful video by Jason. If we have time later, we can circle back to it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the great introduction, Caitlin. We really, really appreciate your expertise on this topic. So I would like to now introduce our second speaker. Donnie Rosa is the General Manager of the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation. As a leader in this urban setting, Donnie draws on their experience working in shelters, the mental health field in Toronto, and over 25 years working in parks and recreation. Currently, Donnie is president-elect of the BC Recreation and Parks Association and was recently on the board of CPRA as well. Donnie attempts to bring a compassionate approach to encampments, working collaboratively with partners in the community to bring folks experiencing homelessness inside and provide access to green spaces for all. Donnie brings their partner experience to this conversation and in no way claims to be an expert on homelessness or housing, but rather is a community developer with a municipal recreation lens. And Donnie told me that she also wants to work for the UN and put that on her resume. So we're cheering for you there, Donnie.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Who follows somebody who works with the UN? Oh my goodness, that was bad call on my part. Anyway, thank you, Krista and Caitlin. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing on this front. I am Donnie Rosa. My pronouns are she and they, and I am joining you from the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, the Coast Salish people. Today I'm wearing orange to honor the 215 children whose remains were found in the Tecumloops and Secwepemc territory at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School here in BC, and for all who lost their lives or relations in residential schools. And it's appropriate and deeply emotional to be wearing this today and to be talking about this today. And so I am not a homelessness expert, a housing expert at all. I'm not an encampment expert. I'm simply sharing with you my experience over the last 8 months. I do have 25 plus years experience in Parks and Rec, and never once did I think that I would have the experience and the education that I've had over this last 8 months I've been in this job for 8 months. The encampment was much longer. It's interesting, Caitlin talked about Principle 4, all viable alternatives to eviction. Without knowing that, our approach to the decampment or the relocation of folks was to take a trauma-informed harm reduction and reconciliation lens to the work that we were doing. Our goal was to do this work without enforcement or as little as possible, with lots of patience, communication, engagement with campers. And frankly, it slowed the process quite a bit, but we kept moving in the right direction and tried to move at a pace that was, I suppose, palatable and manageable for folks. Next slide, please. Strathcona Park the encampment lasted 347 days. And it only began after an 18-month encampment at Oppenheimer Park. And Oppenheimer was about 1 hectare, or for my American friend on here, 2.5 acres. The camp was removed by an injunction by the province for health reasons. It was under a health order, and it moved immediately to Strathcona Park, started with 15 tents and grew significantly. Strathcona Park is about 10 hectares or 25 acres. This camp is surrounded by, was surrounded by community on one side, the Strathcona community, and a business on the other side. So trucks going in and out the side streets on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So this was Canada's largest encampment. And if you look at the picture on the left, it actually doesn't, this was early on. It grew to be all those gray areas on the gravel field were filled in. So it grew to be much larger. At its peak, there were about 500 tents. And while there were 500 tents, many folks have a couple of tents or a few tents for their things, or a tent becomes unusable, so they move on to another. And there's a lot of reasons for the number of tents, but it's really important to understand as well the number of people. And I'll get into that a little bit later. I put this bullet point that the surrounding community was outraged and the surrounding community was supportive, because that was the line that we walked. The surrounding community is a very compassionate community, and they did not want us to evict, remove people without a place to go. The surrounding community also adored and really missed their green space, which they have not as much of as the rest of the community, maybe. And so they were at odds with their own community, feeling they wanted to get the park decamped, but also they wanted to do it in the right way. And a lot of my time was spent talking to the surrounding community to understand them, but also just to keep them informed of the process, again, which I'll get into. We did have some really healthy things going on with the camp, including we did programming for the campers through a Indigenous food sovereignty program, and it was one of our own arts and culture programs. We did work with camp leadership very closely. And, you know, it wasn't perfect at all, but we worked as closely as we could to understand the needs. And I personally spent a lot of time on the ground at the camp to understand the people and the needs. So in January this past year, which is our winter in BC, essentially, we were able to work with the province and the city to add services to the camp. So we added a warming tent, as well as some showers and washrooms, and these were all with peer supports. So we hired through the province, they hired a peer support program to both clean in the camp, but also to manage the washrooms and the warming tent. And eventually the campers themselves put up an overdose prevention site, which was also peer monitored. It was 24 hours a day and proved to be a very important part of the camp. You see on the picture on the right, we did have fires, as we do at many encampments. We did at some point soon after have do a fire order. One of the things that was unique here was that the fire order not only came to Parks and Rec, but it went to the camp leadership as well as to the province, because we were all sharing in the responsibility of the camp. And in sharing in that responsibility, you have to take the campers' wellness into account. And as a Parks and Rec people, that came naturally to us, and certainly wanting to do the best by the people who were in this community, as well as the surrounding community. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we were taking a harm reduction, trauma-informed reconciliation lens. And I have to say that this really was not natural in the institutions that came together. We had 3 levels of government come together to do this work, and it wasn't a natural place for us. Our way of work is to set a goal, work toward that goal, and make it happen. And that just is not how you do this. If you want to do it in a way that is without huge police presence and without huge enforcement. So what we found that was that, you know, we did make space to honor ceremony. So for the 2 to 3 weeks that we were relocating folks, We started with an hour and a half ceremony every single morning. We gathered around, we brought in we engaged some Indigenous leaders who agreed to help us through this process, and we healed the staff and the campers who wanted to join each morning, and then regrouped each night to talk about how the day went and remind ourselves that we're doing this work with a reconciliation lens, harm reduction and trauma-informed approach. We also made sure that we were honoring the protocol for the ceremonial or sacred fire. This was a big part of this encampment. And so each and every time we went in, we went and paid our respects at the sacred fire. We also made sure that when we were in conversation with the camp leadership or the campers, that we came with food and that we were culturally respectful of how dialogue was to take place. It wasn't just to sit down and get right to work. It was to sit down and actually get to know each other and talk and really understand each other on a different level. We made sure that the communication throughout, while not perfect, we had to communicate to the community surrounding the camp. We had to communicate to our elected bodies, and in this case, 3 different elected bodies. So coordinating that messaging was a challenge. But even more important was making sure that we communicated with the campers. And so we worked with camp leadership to make sure that there was a community board, that we were able to put information there, that they were comfortable with the messaging that we were going out with. They may not have been comfortable with the end goals and stuff, but they were comfortable with us communicating through them or us communicating through the community boards. I think that it's so important for us to remember that this space, as Parks and Rec people, this space was community to so many people. And so even when we took an incremental approach to housing, relocating folks, they would come back during the day and hang out with their friends because this space was a space for their community. And so one of the learnings that we took away was, how do we make sure that this community who lived in this park for 347 days feel that connection to this park still and can come back and participate in recreation here, whether it's playing chess with each other or having ceremonial fires that we can support, having Indigenous teachings, having community art programs. We do have an Indigenous healing garden in this park now. So there's lots that we can do as Parks and Rec folks to make sure that all members of the community are welcome in our spaces. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that this was 3 levels of government here in Vancouver. We have an elected park board. So that was one level of government that we had to work with, who are responsible for the ground, on the ground, the park itself. We have, of course, the province, who is responsible for housing, and the city, who plays a role in homeless outreach and housing as well. Interestingly, the staff certainly came together and realized we had to work together. And what happened was that it went to the elected officials, who then signed an MOU amongst themselves between the province, city, and park board. And this MOU was signed with on the park board behalf. So from Parks and Rec, it was signed with some conditions. I was delegated authority to seek an injunction, but only under certain conditions. So one was that we took a reconciliation approach to this work, which that was on me to make sure of that. And I was grateful that our partners were on board with that as well. The other was that the province and the city needed to confirm that there was enough indoor space available for every single person sleeping in the park. And so that was a little tricky, because it's tough to do the census. How many people are actually sleeping there? How many people are there on weekends? How many people are there during the week? It was really important to understand and do a census of folks and understand their needs, not just that they were sleeping there. Because what I learned through this, among many other things, was that an indoor space doesn't mean, check, that's done, you have an indoor space. What are the wraparound services needed to move somebody indoors? What are the appropriate spaces? Can family members be there? Can they have visitors? During COVID, this was particularly challenging. So one of the conditions was that we needed to have enough indoor space, appropriate indoor space for the folks in the park. And then the third condition was that we had to work together to relocate folks with the province, the city, but also with the campers. That was an important part of this, that we weren't going to just move ahead and do this to people. We were going to try to do it with them. And then the final piece was that we would work to heal the land and heal the community. And I think it's really important to really focus on what that healing might look like. So healing the land is an important cultural move as well. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that I had delegated authority to seek an injunction, and that we would do this in a incremental way. So the first thing I did was I actually did a GM order, which basically said that no overnight sheltering would be allowed in the west side of this park and the north side. So what we were trying to do was to make sure the camp was all in one area, and then providing the services. So along the right side of your picture by the soccer field, that's where we provided all the services. So we wanted folks to have access to the services. At the request of the camp leadership, we fenced that area. They wanted to be protected and fenced off and have controls. They actually had their own system whereby people had rules to follow and respect that they needed to pay, and they also needed to follow the cultural practice of the camp. So we worked with folks. We set a 2-week period to move folks from the west and north side into the east side. But during that time, and at that time, there were probably only about 15 to 20 tents on that side. So it was easy enough to do. And at that time, we actually moved almost all of them indoors. A few of them also moved to the east side. And what that did was it allowed us to start to heal and to remediate the land on the west side in order to return it to general use. It seems so odd to say return it to general use when really we took it in the first place, but that's a whole other seminar and webinar. Anyway, the final encampment or final GM order, we gave 3 weeks for folks to be relocated from the park. And what we found is it actually took longer, and that was okay. Next slide, please. So in the end, we moved 280 plus people indoors. This is, you kind of follow the story of this gentleman. This was in the Vancouver Sun. He did a nice interview. And it shows, the top picture shows his structure, and what he was doing was leaving it there for someone else to sleep in. And then of course there was an intake process, and then he had his own space. And on the last day, when the majority of folks moved out on April 30th of this year, I was there at 10 o'clock at night as people were still moving. We brought U-Hauls. The province worked with folks. They brought U-Hauls and moved everybody in a Herculean effort. And people were leaving and actually thanking us and saying, they were excited to lock their door tonight. There were a lot of people who came back. Someone I became friends with, and he said, sorry I'm late, but I took a bath and I stayed in the bath, and it was so good. And so there were a lot of really great things that came out of this. The province stepped up and demonstrated that they had enough spaces. The city stepped up and worked with the province to create spaces. And there were well over 280 spaces. There were closer to 400 spaces available so that we could have that flexibility in the types of spaces. I learned a lot through this, and I know I've probably missed a lot too, but I'll finish with sharing the things that I feel we possibly did wrong. on after the day that the final GM order was up, April 30th, we figured, okay, on the next day we would go in and start to clean up the debris. And a couple of things came out of that. One was, well, first of all, there were a few campers, the camp leadership, who were helping other folks move. They didn't have time to pack their own things. And so we realized, oh, we need to give more time for the camp leadership to actually pack their things. And we, of course, were there helping. And so we said, okay, you know what, 3 more days. And everybody who has left and signed a waiver that their tent was done, that they had moved, we gave them 3 more days to come back and retrieve their things. And so my mistake was, on the second day, we had an area that was fenced off, that was all waivered, and we thought, no, this is all done. This area is done. And we brought in the big machines, and part of doing, I guess, a clearing of that space was police needed to be on hand for the staff. And that was really triggering for folks. And what I learned was, what I used to think was debris, or what some of us would look at and say, oh, that's debris, was people's homes and their belongings and everything they owned in the world. And I learned that earlier on in the camp, but somehow I didn't think of that. I didn't respect that. Once they signed a waiver, I thought, oh, their things are ready to go. And I was wrong on that. And I would wait. There was no rush to get the machinery in there. There was no need to get in there and clean up until every single person had been moved indoors. And quite frankly, then just to leave the space at peace for a while would have been the right approach. So I would have done that differently. As it was, we then had more folks to move, and we then left the space. We left it as peaceful for as long as we could. And then we went in and we actually gave folks and activists and community probably another 3 weeks in total to come in and pick everything that they thought could be reused. And I, the amount of trucks that move things into storage, I can't even tell you the final number because we just finished last week. So, but things that were moved into storage to be used or repurposed in the community, was a really important piece of this. And I'm really glad that the campers pushed for that. It certainly wasn't, it wasn't us. We didn't see it that way. The other thing I think I would have done differently if I was in control and of the housing part or could influence that, is that the camp leadership actually had a really great census of who was in the camp. And so our folks went in and did a census as well. And we had this combined. So they had theirs and we had ours, and we were developing housing. Our folks were developing housing based on that. And it wasn't until the last, couple of days where we actually sat down with them and said, okay, help us understand this person and their needs, and this person and this person. And for some reason, we have policy about not being able to share that information. So it was tricky to do. But it was important to hear from the camp leadership why Jeremy needed to be in a space that had this, because they've been living with those people for the last number of years, and they know what the people in their community need. The other thing I would have done differently is that we did have a fire order, and it was, as I said, it was for the park board, for the city, the park board, the province, and the camp leadership. I would have worked a lot closer with the camp leadership to make sure that our protocols on site were really focused on safety. We could do that, and in retrospect, it wasn't easy to do. It needed a lot of buy-in and a lot of work, but I would have worked harder around the safety aspect of it, knowing what I know now. And I think that I'll just finish on the things that I think we did right, and I hope that it influences others. But really truly grounding ourselves in reconciliation, and really truly grounding ourselves in the intention to see that we were working with people who had been traumatized, deep trauma, and that harm reduction was our goal. That was, I think, the right approach. We, of course, had some bylaws put in place. We have a park control bylaw that helps us to avoid future encampments. We had the delegated authority to seek an injunction, and I'm grateful to say I never had to seek that injunction. It was always my goal to not seek an injunction and do this with enforcement. What we did right was collaboration, the three levels of government and the camp leadership and the community. That was really important. What we did right was we had patience. There were days when we actually had police and other services on site. And I remember saying to them, not today, you're gonna go home today, or go do other work today. Today, we're gonna leave the campers. It's not a good day for them. Things would happen in the media. Missing and murdered Indigenous Women's Day was a quiet day at camp. That was during our decampment process. We weren't going to go and cause further trauma on those particular days. We tried to be nimble for big organizations, and we tried to be very communicative. And I will share with you, on the final day, we had one camper who said she wasn't going to leave the camp. And so we engaged the Indigenous Relations Officer from our Vancouver Police Department, who, by the way, were fabulous during this, in that they were around but not visible. They were supportive but not overtaking the work. Our Indigenous Relations Officer went in and spent a few hours talking to this person. And it was a pretty intense moment when they walked out together, and the camp was then fenced. And that was, the goal was that people would walk out, and we would bring them to their new space, and we would put their things in storage, or we would work with them to do that. So to finish the encampment in that way was a really important step, and something I think we did right. Anyway, I think I've taken my time. Thank you. And again, I'm not a homelessness expert. I'm not a housing expert, but I'm not much of an expert on anything, but I certainly learned a lot over the last 8 months. Thank you.
Donnie, thank you so much. Very powerful, as somebody had actually said in the chat, and really appreciate you sharing that, and for your compassion and care in doing this work. So I think the UN does need you. I see a future there for you. Awesome. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce Anthony Paul Diaz, who goes by AP. AP is the executive officer for the Los Angeles Department of Recreation and Parks. He has over 23 years of professional experience and service to the city of Los Angeles. Prior to assuming his current role, AP served as general counsel for Recreation and Parks, helping guide the department on many high-profile and important endeavors, most notably the transformation, restoration, and management model for the historic and iconic Greek theater. He also served as a city attorney in the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office and worked in the city's neighborhood prosecutor program, working on non-traditional methods to reduce community crime, and later served as one of the principal city attorneys assigned to advise and staff the Los Angeles City Council. AP is a faculty member for the NRPA's Directors School. He chairs the NRPA's Parks and Recreation Magazine editorial advisory group and is a member of the World Urban Parks Association. So AP, we're thrilled to have you join us today. Our only counterpart today from the US, so would love to hand this over to you now if you want to share your screen and go from there.
Great, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, or good morning. Can you all see me? Because it says my camera's disabled, so I want to make sure you can.
We can't see you. We can see your slides.
Presentation. Perfect.
Can't see you.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. I am just really thrilled to be here and to be in the company of such great people and my friends up north in Canada, who are all doing amazing work on this. And it's interesting, you know, Donnie was saying, you know, she's not an expert. And, you know, it's really hard to be an expert on this issue. I think you just have to, at the end of the day, really bring your fundamental base as a human being and demonstrate, you know, a scintilla of compassion and understanding that could be you or someone you love. And it helps put it in perspective, but certainly makes none of us experts unless we've actually walked in those shoes. So I want to walk you through a little bit today of what's going on in Los Angeles with homelessness, and particularly with an emphasis on this past year during the pandemic, which I thought would be interesting for all of you because it's been even more of a challenging situation for our city, which experiences the most homelessness in the entire United States. Next slide, please. So I wanted to sort of start with the frame of what parkland means in the city of Los Angeles. So in the early 1920s, in our city charter, which is like our constitution for the city of Los Angeles, the park department was set up as such that it would be placed in the freehold charter, which was adopted in the late 1800s, and placed under its own jurisdiction, where parks and public sites would be set aside for the perpetual use of the community. And that was as acknowledged in the original Spanish land grants from where our city was born out of. And in that city charter, or the city charter documents of the 1800s, the first words, "parks shall be open for all," was the first iteration of that concept. Next slide. Thank you. So we call them the rights inviolate. These are sort of the permanent rights as described in the charter. And the most important areas of our city are found in that charter. And that's where we derive our authority to do really sort of anything. And so the words in the charter are very important and have been interpreted at different times to mean different things. But again, another iteration in the 500 section states that all lands set apart or dedicated as public park property shall forever remain for the use of the public inviolate. And there's a reason why I'm starting on this theme, because it comes into play when we start dealing with people experiencing homelessness. So as an example, in Griffith Park, which was the slide with the observatory for any of you who have ever been to Los Angeles, it's our largest urban park in the United States. It's 4,200 acres. It was originally a Spanish land grant and then was purchased by Colonel Griffith J. Griffith, who was a miner from Wales and who dedicated and bequeathed the entire estate to the city of Los Angeles, with the caveat that it should forever be a place of respite, rest, and relaxation, open for the masses, again, for all people. And probably the greatest gift we received as parkland in LA. Next slide. So common spaces, common places, right? Parks are also unique in the United States because they are traditional public forums. So they are treated by the federal Constitution and in alignment with the First Amendment, freedom of expression and right to assemble. It's treated like a town square in that it is a place where the public can come and exercise their rights to free speech. And as a public forum, it's a place that has to only be reasonably restricted. In other words, it should be open at all times and should not be restricted unless there's a reasonable rationale to do so or for a limited purpose. And that's what the courts have identified. Parks and public spaces, therefore, must be equally aware and mindful not to use them in any way that is seen as quelling public speech or other unreasonable restrictions of park use. Next slide. So the seminal question in this is, now fast forwarding to 2021, are parks really open for all? We've seen as late as the 1800s, or as early as the 1800s, I should say, a very intentional and definitive delineation of parks as being set aside spaces, federally protected under the US Constitution, protected under the state and local constitutions as being areas that are free and accessible, open for all, should be some place of respite and relaxation and something open for the masses. But this is a conundrum that's facing urban parks today, particularly in the city of Los Angeles. And I'll just tell you as a park professional that not too far along ago in previous decades, there was in the cities of the United States, there was always this conundrum of what to do with homeless individuals or people experiencing homelessness. And really the way that parks were looked as that when homeless people came into parks, the immediate response was to push them away and to push them out so that you could try to keep the park open and clean and accessible, but wasn't necessarily treating everybody individually the same, because we were making judgments that these individuals had no right to be in the park, should not be in the park, and were a detriment to the park, and therefore we should push them out. The same thing in urban cities. If they got too close to downtown areas, if they got too close to residential areas or schools, we would push them out. And for any of you who know about the downtown Skid Row in Los Angeles, or if you watched the recent Netflix, the Cecil Hotel, you'll see that we've had to carve out large areas, concentrative areas that are a result of us pushing people away, but really just creating a very large and hazardous zone. So today during the pandemic, we were really faced with this conundrum even more, as I'll show you next. So 2020 was a really interesting year for all of us, right? I'm calling it the Great Pause, or the year to remember. The world faced a myriad of challenges, a ton of shelter-in-place orders, park restrictions, social injustices, civil unrest, homeless issues exacerbated tenfold in the United States. COVID-19 really quashed our daily practices, forcing the entire world to adapt to one that we knew 15 months ago and never could imagine that we would be living through. And parks have really had to step up and amplify their reach during this time, particularly in Los Angeles as healing spaces to really transform a world hungry for peace, play, and wellness. And it came in a lot of different forms, and kind of just wanted to show you how parks can be viewed as healing spaces, but also the role that they have played and can continue to play in the years ahead. Next slide. So this is just a quick graphic of how we thought the world would be ready for a global pandemic or some sort of national or international health threat. And this was from before the pandemic. If you had asked, how is the world ready to deal with a pandemic? You would see some of the top, Western nations, including us both, Canada and the US, as being very high in terms of their global index score for being ready to respond, as well as other nations, and then sort of a ranking of other countries throughout the world based on their sort of best practices in place. What we saw quickly was this graph was actually completely turned upside down, evidence in the next slide. So at the beginning of the pandemic and sort of those early days when it was just going awful, and then there was a turn started in Europe, if you remember, and New York, and then there was a trend where you could see, if you compared and contrast the EU with the US population, off by 100 million, but still somewhat similar, you could see that we got to a point that the European Union took a dramatic turn at that time, and the cases dramatically began to decrease, even though they had increased tangentially in the very beginning. In the second portion of that, we saw the United States, go up dramatically in New York, start to trickle down a little bit, and then we just started on a trajectory back upwards. And there was, for a while, a huge differential, if you remember, in how these two areas of the world were responding to the pandemic. Next slide. So again, we had to put all of our traditional practices on hold, as well as all of you listening as well. We had some really serious health threats to respond to in the United States and in Los Angeles. And looking at our traditional places of respite and relaxation were all completely closed We had to close down all of our 450 parks in Los Angeles, all recreation centers, all hiking trails, all beaches, all playgrounds, taped off, fenced up. Like you, we were just living in a world of isolation. But during this time, as our government leaders were telling us that we all needed to shelter in place, do not go out, do not move, just stay in place to be safe in those early days. It really created sort of this, well, what do we do with our homeless population in Los Angeles? And it was determined that the best thing to do was to, first of all, not touch any encampments, not displace any individuals. But if you're telling people that they have to shelter in place, that must include the homeless. This is their home for now, and they need to be able to stay safely where they were. But what we also were concerned about in Los Angeles, there's some 60,000 people living on the streets of Los Angeles experiencing homelessness. And there was a real fear that this was going to take off like wildfire, in that the entire CBD downtown could be just ravaged with this disease, people who were experiencing homelessness and people who were not, and really sort of began to imagine a city of 4 million people potentially being ravaged by COVID. And so what we decided to do, and what we were asked to do in the park department, was to convert our recreation centers into shelters and bring people out of the streets, those who wanted to come, and they could come to the parks, and we could transform our rec centers into 24/7 homeless shelters with food and all of the things needed to run that. And we really had to step up to the call. The mayor made that a priority for the city of Los Angeles. And we had to immediately work with a bunch of providers to transform and equip these shelters, work we had never, ever done before as park professionals. Next slide. Here's what our recreation centers look like. That's a basketball gym, which was converted into a rec center with individual beds, 90-gallon trash bins for each person, their own space. Obviously, they were given masks. They were given, we had mobile showers come in if we didn't use our recreation center showers, or if they didn't have them. We had mobile showers outside. We had food tents. We had hot boxes that we had to learn about, where you have to put your clothes in before that de-lice your belongings. And we had to staff all of these centers with our recreation staff who became emergency responders in the early days. All of us in the park department were considered emergency responders. In addition, in this past year, we've had to also use 50 other gyms for alternative learning sites, where children who could not stay home and do school online because their parents are first responders or working and couldn't stay home alone, they would come to our rec centers and would have their own desk and their own bin and their laptops, and we had to get Wi-Fi, and they could do school from the center. And we also took in 550 trailers from the state of California and from Camping World, and we equipped those as isolation trailers, because what would happen is, just like all of us, and we can remember this in the very beginning days, you'd have someone in this shelter that all of a sudden tested positive. They couldn't stay in that congregate setting, right? They had to then isolate. Well, us at home, we would go to another bedroom, or some of us were going to garages or basements. There was no place for them to go. So we then had to start equipping each site with trailers so that an individual could go into a trailer, quarantine, self-isolate, and hopefully get better. And that was, again, just another huge effort that we undertook. And then we also are now doing vaccination centers, which is the next phase of our response. Next slide. So here's just a snapshot of what Los Angeles looked like a lot last year. Those individuals you see at the top, I love that picture because they are LA Rec and Parks employees. You have a basketball coach there, a rec director, a lifeguard, attendant, you have a secretary. My point is that you just have people that were, teaching our kids how to do sports and running our parks, And they had to become fully equipped in Tyvek suits and face shields and learn safety protocols and step up to make all of this work. And we couldn't have done it without them. They really are heroes and sheroes. So these are just amazing people. And here's LA just, under lockdown, some of our parks and golf courses and, trying to get help along the way from different resources. Next slide. Here's the iconic downtown LA freeway exchange. If any of you have ever been there, this was on a Friday at 3 o'clock. I was in a helicopter doing a survey of the city and would never see a freeway like this on a Friday afternoon during rush hour. But just again, a perspective of the enormity of the shutdown in a city of 4 million. Next slide. So when we talk about people experiencing homelessness, there are proponents and opponents, right, to the use of public space or even how to approach this situation. Sorry, I just realized that I added another zero on that slide. It is not 66 million, although honestly, it can feel like that when you're in some areas because it's just so overwhelming. There are 66,000 people on the streets of LA experiencing homelessness. So that's just Los Angeles, right? What are the solutions? Do we use parkland? It's really hard. A lot of proponents of doing more work to try to grapple with this situation and the lack of housing have a hard time reconciling 15 golf courses that are however many hectares? I'll stick with my own acres that are, it's hard to reconcile that. It's hard to look at huge amounts of parkland and say we don't have places to build these types of housing. But certainly, like every community project, there's the NIMBY. There's people that don't want that in their backyard, not in my park, maybe that park. It violates the city charter. You can't build that in parkland. You can't take it away. So these are all sort of things that we're grappling with. So some of the things that we're working on right now is temporary housing. It's also called bridge housing or pallet homes, where you bring in a transitional mode of living to offer people opportunities to get a hand up, to get job skills, to have some connection to society, with the goal of getting employed and housed. And so we're beginning to use that in a temporary basis up to 3 years. Our city attorney has determined we can do that on parkland. But already there's lawsuits on both sides of this saying that, we can't do this, we have to stop. We have federal lawsuits that have placed the city of Los Angeles under an injunction. Right now, the federal government is saying the situation is so bad, you are not providing enough housing, you can't enforce your laws, so people cannot be punitized for living on the street. People cannot be asked to take their tents down because you simply have no solution for them, Los Angeles. And so now we are working furiously to try to make a dent into this so that we can get out of the federal injunctions and also sort of just try to keep the city safe as much as possible and accessible, but also try to deal with this growing situation. Next slide.
And AP, we have about 1 minute left.
Perfect. Okay. So just wrapping up, like Donnie, we went through at Echo Park recently. This is what this situation untouched looked like during the pandemic. And then just go forward to the after slides. We had to, unfortunately, like Donnie, it's really hard because you have those proponents and opponents on both sides, and dealing with all of this in the middle of it was not a fun thing to do. And then the last slide shows you, I think, the park situation after our most recent cleanup. And so that was a $550,000 project to close this park for 3 weeks to get it back in shape. So, but we're open again. So I will pause there. I will just say that we're trying to do many things. We're trying to be innovative. And I really think that's the only approach you can do. There's no one playbook for any of this. There's no one solution. You just have to have people that are committed and passionate. We saw a woman on the chat, I believe from Manitoba, who's working in a shelter or working as a counselor. God bless you, because being compassionate like that and dealing with people on that one-on-one level is what really makes it. And us on this level just have to be open and aware to both sides and try to find that delicate balance in between, because you'll never have clarity or unity on this subject. But at the end of the day, it's one about compassion, it's one about human beings, and it's one about taking care of one another. And so that's what we'll continue to do and work together on this screen. And again, thank you for letting me just share a small perspective of what's going on in Los Angeles. Thank you.
AP, thank you so much. You have so much, again, knowledge and experience on this topic, and like Donnie, compassion in the work that you do. So really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. I know there'll be some questions at the end, but I'd like to just turn everything over back to Caitlin, and Caitlin is going to introduce you to Caroline and Jane, both of whom are lived experts, and we're so pleased and thankful to have their perspective today.
Hi, welcome back. I'm so thrilled to have my wonderful colleagues Carolyn and Jane here with us today. When we were developing this webinar, we felt it was really obviously critical to be hearing from folks who are kind of doing this frontline work, supporting communities who are living on the streets, doing peer support work, and kind of the importance of lived expertise as we try to navigate doing this from a rights-based place and from a good place. So I'm going to let Carolyn and Jane introduce themselves and share their expertise with us. Yeah, welcome to you both.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you everyone so far. This has been super interesting and important discussion. I'm Jane Malenfant. My pronouns are they and she. I am a PhD candidate at McGill University in Chauchage, or so-called Montreal. Caroline Leblanc is also joining me, and you can introduce yourself a bit, Caroline. We are both researchers who work in homelessness. We both have a Vanier Scholarship, Pierre Elliott Trudeau Scholarship, and are researching things that we have lived experiences of. We're both also involved in leadership in the Lived Experience Scholars Network through Making the Shift. So really thinking of how to engage people with lived experience on these topics. Caroline is also, this is an area of expertise for her. So I'm really excited to be joining you. And Caroline, maybe I'll just pass it on to you to get started.
Thank you, Jen. Hi, everyone. We can start the slide. Next slide. Perfect. So today, I just want to explain you why the people can be unsheltered. It's so many reasons, and I just want to show a few of them. A few reasons of them to remind us that the shelter are not adapted to everyone. So what we have to understand is, on one side, some people avoid the shelter because they are, example, afraid to having their personal effects stolen or contracting a virus, or because drug and alcohol use is not allowed, so which become a major problem for people who are addicted. Because by following the rule, they can get sick, and if not, they can get banned because they did use in the shelter. And in the other side, some people are just not accepted in the shelter. Example, when people have a dog, share his life with a partner, or when the transgender person doesn't have the appearance conform to the gender requested by the services. So we have to know also, if they have access, they can get stigmatized and they can put at risk of violence. So often they will feel safer outside the shelter. And finally, sometimes the people don't have access because it's not enough place available, or they just don't want to go because they feel infantilized and because they want to maintain their autonomy and privacy. So Jen?
Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, I think a lot of these things have been touched on, but I wanted to talk a bit about what it looks like in encampments right now. Donnie, I really appreciated what you were talking about, because we recently had an encampment taken down here in Montreal, and it was a bunch of riot cops who went in. And so a very different approach, I think, to this, not necessarily thinking through why people might not be accessing shelters. And so I was working frontline at an organization during COVID. Tents were a huge demand because of many reasons. One being that shelter capacity was diminished. Social services were not necessarily open in ways that people could maintain stability. So safe injection sites, food banks, mental health services weren't being accessed in the same ways. And this is constantly shifting during the pandemic. But I think safety in shelters was a huge part and continues to be a huge part of this. Here and elsewhere, public health measures, hooked into policing apparatuses. So a lot of the people I've been working with were getting tickets for being outside when they had nowhere else to go. And so this is something that happens anyway, but during the pandemic, it has often been a lot more and a lot more frequent. And then the cost of housing, which Caitlin touched on, for us in Montreal in the last year, the cost of unattended units has gone up 30%. So like people just cannot afford housing anymore. So if you have nowhere to go, you often end up either hidden homeless or on the streets. So maybe next slide. And this is something that I think, Donnie, you got at really well, and is something that I always try to bring into spaces where people might not be engaging with people with lived experience of homelessness a lot. And I work with youth. And so one thing that I really want to emphasize is, as a professional engaging with someone who has lived experience and living experiences of homelessness, it's very likely that they have had a lot of traumatic experiences with figures of authority, whether you're a police officer or not, doctors, social workers, anyone who's coming in. There's so many reasons why trust might not be there. And so that is a huge barrier to people accessing services often as well. I know, Donnie, you also mentioned the residential school in Kamloops. This is something that is inherently linked into colonialism in Canada, intergenerational trauma, discrimination from, day one for many people in institutions. So recognizing that as we're building interventions is really important in centering people's wellness and safety. And then Carolyn touched on it a bit, not being believed and having these paternalistic kind of, you should be acting this way in order to get housing. And that links into Caitlin's discussion also of how housing is a human right for everyone, which no matter what they're doing. Next slide.
Okay, so I imagine the eviction like a circle of exclusion. For me, the eviction is can have significant impact on the well-being of people who are on shelter. So the first is unsheltered people have to live in more in the public space and face the bylaw and the urban design who are not adapt to them. So we know the bylaw are put in first to control the public space and protect the population, but they can't have direct impact on people who are occupy those space because they are not able to exist anywhere and they get kicked out everywhere they go. So the social acceptability may provoke the people who are on shelter may provoke negative reaction in the population, and they will have to face really harsh judgment from the population. This intolerance can put them into an isolation spot and make them invisible because they don't want to get evicted. About the eviction is not without any consequence. They can disrupt their personal routine, put them in constantly movement, reduce them social network and support they receive in the encampment to protect themselves and their personal effect. And also eviction can push them away from services that they can help them and expose them to significant danger, such as violence and overdose risk. Next slides, please. So if we want to have an answer adapt to homelessness, we must consider the situation of the people who are unsheltered by promoting their autonomy, dignity, and self-determination. To do this, we need to create stable and safe environment and building trust between them and the authority to eliminate or reduce the stress of being unsheltered and allow people to focus on their well-being. For that, we need to engage people who are unsheltered in the response because they are in the best position to find the gaps in the system and identify what will be helpful for them. More we're gonna oppress them, more we're gonna push them to live in an unsafe spot and put them life in danger. Oppressing people who are excluded from housing must stop. We need to focus on the real issues that unsheltered people face and recognize them like a citizen. We need to look at the encampment not as an individual problem, but as a systemic issues so we can have a better response to support them. Thank you for sharing this space of dialogue with me.
Thank you, Carolyn. I wanted to add one thing too before we get into Q&A, because Donnie, you mentioned time. And I think in this question of how we meaningfully engage and consult with people with lived experiences, that question of time is so important. It comes up again and again of like, how do you get out of this solutions? Like, you know, we're going to do this, it's going to lead to this, and people will be out of the parks. But I think that issue of time and taking time, like people who have lived experience know that it takes time to get people to where they're at. It takes time to meet people where they're at. It takes time to do things in a decolonizing way. And it's so important in our responses where I think we're always trying to check boxes and we're always trying to make sure like, okay, someone's got housing, this, that, to take time to actually build trust and relationships with people to find out what they need and what they want you to be doing to support them, because people don't want to be homeless. They want to have choices and they want to have support. So I think that, and community, that's really important. But yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you so much to both of you. Well, to all of our speakers, we're just trying to see whether or not we can get the video that Caitlin shared at the beginning. And in the meantime, if anybody else has any questions, there have been a number in the Q&A, and I think many of them have been answered. So I'm just looking to see in case anybody else has any other questions that they would like to type in. Because I think MJ's just trying to, oh, sorry, I will address, yes. There have been a couple of questions about whether or not we can share the slide deck. We can. And we also we have recorded the session, and the session will be available. For those of you who registered, you'll get, which I guess is all of you, you will get a link that has the information to be able to get the video and also, or the recording. And we will also have it on the CPRA website, so you can access it on the website as well. So they will both be available within probably by the end of the week. So any other questions that anybody has? Again, we did answer some throughout the way. And also I should note that in the, I think it's in the chat section, there are a number of links that Caitlin had put in there. So if you want to, you can quickly grab those as well. And the other thing while we're waiting, oh, we have the video now. So I'm going to ask MJ if she will just start that. And then we will, if in the meantime, while it's playing, there are any other questions, we'll quickly try to grab them. So over to you, MJ. Thanks. maybe what I'll do if, since it's not coming up just yet, I'll let you know that we do have,
there just seems to be, rules and regulations around everything, and not being able to get into places to warm up, especially, like Tim Hortons, McDonald's, those are all now closed. If I don't have anywhere safe to put my head down, if I don't have anywhere to, I'm supposed to be on a medical bed because I can't sit up properly because of my spinal cord injury. My name is Jason Chadwick. I'm currently at the Central Park Encampment in Victoria, British Columbia. The social distancing is made the encampment, a lot more difficult. Anywhere that you'd use for a washroom or to plug in for anything, electrical outlets, bathrooms have all become inaccessible. There just seems to be, rules and regulations around everything, and not being able to get into places to warm up, especially, like Tim Hortons, McDonald's, those are all now closed. If I don't have anywhere safe to put my head down, if I don't have anywhere to, I'm supposed to be on a medical bed because I can't sit up properly because of my spinal cord injury. I don't feel safe. I was attacked in a shelter 10 years ago in Vancouver, and so I don't get any really good rest here. I'm just constantly in a state of stress. Cold is coming, and we're having tent fires. Someone that was staying in my tent the other day because he doesn't have his own tent and they won't let us put up any other tents here, had a candle going and caught his sleeping bag on fire. I'm terrified that there's going to be a fire or something like that and I'm going to die here. We're not allowed to have open flame, but it's the only way to keep warm. There's no electrical access here. They promised us that they wouldn't displace us, and they are. The only thing that they provide for us is a police state. They come in here and with the bylaw and the police, and it scares most people. If I had access to showers so I could keep my hygiene up, I'd be working right now, and I can't even work because I have no access to my basic needs. Like I'm constantly searching for food, washrooms, even water. They don't even have proper potable water here. I thought that the government existed to look out for our health and well-being. I want my government to respect my right to adequate housing.
Thanks, MJ, for getting that to work. Poor MJ trying to do all this on the fly. That's awesome. Thank you. Just wanted to note another question. So if all the speakers want to turn their cameras back on, I'm not sure this would probably, not sure who this would go to. So whoever would like to take it, do you have any recommendations for domestic violence shelters that are not able to provide services for homelessness due to our service purchase agreement with provincial government? So any recommendations for domestic violence shelters that are not able to provide services for homelessness?
Yeah, this is an enormous challenge related to how policy has kind of been siloed in the violence against women sector and the homelessness sector, and kind of I think at a policy level, lack of understanding of the ways in which folks are flowing between those two sectors. So, I mean, this isn't probably very concretely helpful for you, but we absolutely need policy change around how we define homelessness in relation to domestic violence and the ways in which funding flows to ensure that there is a collaboration, coordination across those sectors. Because right now we know that women, girls, and gender diverse folks and their dependents are falling through the cracks between those two sectors. But it's a really good question, and yeah, others might have thoughts on it as well.
Any other comments? Okay, let me go to somebody wanted to know if anyone had to address the issue of helping vulnerable people against gang recruitment or sex trafficking. Any other issues? AP, I see you nodding. Do you want to take that one?
Sure. So one of the many downsides of living on the streets is that you often are in situations where you're encountering, the criminal element of an urban city. And what we found is that at least in Los Angeles, our individuals experiencing homelessness are really a mix of a lot of different types of people with different backgrounds. So you have people with mental challenges, you have domestic violence victims trying to get away, you have people that are down and out. And then you have really some people that take advantage. You know, it's an easy market for drug use and selling drugs. What we found in our encampments too is that you have to be cognizant and aware and have a partnership with your local law enforcement, because we saw extortion taking places. So in these homeless encampments that are in parks, we never knew. There's actually people that like extort and charge the homeless that if they want to keep their camp here and use this spot, then you have to pay us. And so, you know, and right, people being trafficked in and out. So it's a daunting task, and you really have to go into it in an urban city with a variety of partners. But you do need to have, unfortunately, or fortunately, that law enforcement partner with you, maybe not always visible for outreach and so forth, but always nearby, because the situations are dangerous. I guess I'll just end there saying that they are, you know, there is a lot of danger on the streets. And so really important to be cognizant of it.
Thank you, AP.
Can I just add
Yeah.
just quickly too? I mean, I think there's been tremendous leadership in the women's sector and the feminist sector and Indigenous women's groups that have supported folks in navigating those challenges. So for Parks and Recreations to be boards to be partnering with women's organizations that really know the challenges in their community really well, and what a trauma-informed approach would look like is really a great way to go as well.
Thank you, Caitlin. There's a couple more questions. I know we're at 1:30, but I'll ask them. And if our speakers don't mind staying on, and for those of you who can stay, that would be great. If you can't, we will definitely, as I mentioned, be recording this. So, but let me ask, are people in encampments given opportunities to be connected to coordinated access to housing services? Donnie?
Yes, so absolutely. That's a fundamental, I think, part of trying to really, you know, solve this issue and give some meaning to what you're doing. So part of that outreach has to be bringing in those providers and partners to do the connection for, you know, finding a bed, finding a shelter. But keep in mind, not everybody wants to go to those. There's a lot of fear about going into that kind of setting and situation. So you just have to be aware of that as well. But definitely need to partner with those professionals, because that's where the true help will come. You know, for us, we can just provide the temporary solution and the safe night or, you know, week, but further on is where you really need to do the outreach.
Donnie?
If I could just add that, so we allowed 3 weeks for the service providers to go in and, you know, census and talk to people, but I would have allowed longer to build those relationships. And while we did allow the 3 weeks, over the course of the full year that it was there, we did have outreach workers in there all the time. It was just the intense 3 weeks in the end. But I think that once you have that plan and you know, okay, we have X number of spaces, X number of people in camp, figuring out that amount of time to work with folks and truly understand what today's picture is like, how many people are in this encampment, and who are they, what do they need, so that we can properly A, build relationships of trust if possible, but B, then truly work together to get them into a space where they'll be successful.
Thank you, Donnie. Anybody else have any comments or answers to that, or? Okay. Again, we have gone a bit over time, so I will wrap it up. What I will mention is I think there might be, like I said, 1 or 2 comments or questions. We're going to also try to not just make sure you have the recording, but also access to some of the questions and the comments that were shared in the chat. And so thank you for all of those. Just wanted to very quickly mention, we have another webinar coming up next week. It is on the Restart to Recovery, Reimagining Parks, Recreation, and Community Sport. And it's on June 8th in English at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and on Thursday, June 10th in French at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you can join us for that, that's great. So other than that, I just want to really, really thank our amazing speakers today. This is a topic that is so important. It's not necessarily one that we've talked about at great length or to any extent in the recreation sector. And I know all the recreation folks deal with it and are working on this. And so we're really thrilled that we were able to finally dedicate a webinar to this. And I don't think it'll be the last. I think it'll be the first, and definitely around the whole conversation. We'll probably do one in August with the World Urban Parks Association or organization, and I think that will be another focus. So we'll definitely be sending out more information. So again, Caitlin had to leave us, but to Caitlin, to Donnie, to AP, Jane, Caroline, can't thank you enough for your time and for, again, the compassion and care that you show the members of your community. So thank you, and thank you to all of us for joining us today. Take care, everybody.